medically understood.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today is a super special episode because I have Professor Flowers, Lua Borealis on Twitter. He was my first ever interview guest, and she has delighted me by coming back to have a conversation with me on what I believe will be the 30th episode of the podcast. I'm not 100% sure about that. But if you follow Professor Flowers, then you know that there's been just heaps of bullshit over the past several months, and I'm recording this about 2 months in advance, but I assume that the internet will continue to suck in the intervening period. And Lou and I talk about that. We talk about some of the things that have happened to him in the intervening months since we last spoke, and just sort of the general bullshit state of the online left. And then we talk about what we can do to be more hopeful and productive as leftists on the internet, and how we can actually go about trying to make material change and do something that's actually worthwhile in our lives and in our communities. And it was a really, really fun conversation. I was really happy to get Lua back on the show. Content warnings. We talk about racism, colonialism, debate bros. I think we also mentioned there's some mentions of transphobia. So if any of that is going to cause you psychic damage, then I won't take it personally if you skip this one. For everybody else, I will see you on the other side of the ticking clock, and I will not keep you from the interview any longer. I give you Lua, Professor Flowers. Hey there, folks. This is Mark Edwards from the editing room. I was going through the video and marking timestamps, and I remembered something that I said. I came across something that I said that I think I need to expand upon and clarify a little bit. Because Lou and I were talking about decolonization and how people resist colonialism and how that can inevitably lead to violence. And I said something specifically. I think I said, if you are a member of a colonizer group, if you are a part of a society that has colonized people, who has enslaved people, and you do not divest yourself from that system, then I don't care what happens to you during the anti-colonial effort, which, implies that I don't care if you are treated with violence. And that's true. That is true. That is how I feel. However, that is a position and a statement that I think requires and deserves some qualification. It deserves to be expanded on beyond a sort of hyperbolic statement that I throw out in the middle of an emotional rant on a subject that I feel very passionately about. If you want to know what I sound like when I'm emotional about something, go watch the interview for that bit. It doesn't sound that much different than my normal voice, but that's what was going on there. And I want to take a minute to qualify that statement, not only because it deserves to be qualified, but because when you're talking about large-scale resistance and violence, that is a time to be very careful with your language and to be very careful about what you say, because the voice of a single person isn't going to do much on its own, but somebody hears me say that and then they misunderstand what I mean and they go out and there's the potential that my voice could contribute to actual harm to people who don't deserve it and to the people who are struggling for their own freedom if they misunderstand my point, if either of those people misunderstand me. So, clarification. The first thing that I want to make clear there is that I was making a specifically normative statement. I was talking completely in moral terms and not describing a prescription for action. And that's important for reasons that I'll get to at the end of this, but just bear that in mind as I say all of the following. That it's all in terms of not what you should do, but what you theoretically could do, which would be morally permissible. So when do I think it is morally permissible for subjugated, colonized, enslaved people to use violence against their oppressors? Well, as I say in the interview itself, I believe that oppressed people always have the right to use violence to resist their oppression. Period. End of sentence. This isn't so much about when they have the right to use violence to resist oppression, which I think they always have. It's more about defining what I think are appropriate moral targets for that violence, which, depending on the era in history and where you are in the world, could end up being a lot of people. There are times and places in history where I would argue that the majority of the population would be a legitimate target for anti-oppressive violence, for instance, the antebellum South in America. And there are other times and places where less than a large majority of the population would be a legitimate target. And it's going to vary from time and place, but the number of people for whom it is, in my view, legitimate to deploy violence against from a moral standpoint is generally going to be less than everyone. And what I'd like to lay out is sort of my own personal decision matrix or sorting algorithm for who ultimately it is okay to deploy that tool against. It is important to point out that I am not a moral authority on anything. This is ultimately just my opinion. And I would encourage you to go out and seek the opinions of other people, particularly anti-colonialist activists and educators and scholars, whose opinions may be different than my own. And I would encourage you to consume their content, integrate that material into your thinking, and engage with it meaningfully, whether or not it agrees with my position or not. Some people that are good follows on Twitter, just off the top of my head, Agent Indian, Bryson the Gative, Conquest of Dread, Olufemi Taiwo, who has a great book that just came out on reparations, Dr. CBS, Silver Spooks, St. Andrew, and Luna Oy pretty much always has some indigenous folks, activists on her stream. That's a great place to get alternate perspectives. And if you're someone out there who is an anti-colonial activist or scholar, and whether you agree with me or you disagree with me, and you'd like to come on the show to talk, I'm always interested in platforming people who are doing the real work in the real world. So shoot me an email and we'll hash it out, and there's a good chance I'll get you on the show to talk about your perspective. So who, in my view, constitutes a legitimate moral target for anti-colonial violence, and how do we determine who those people are? Well, first, we need to eliminate racial essentialization. Just because somebody is a member of a racial group or an ethnic group who is actively perpetrating that harm or who has historically done that does not automatically mean that they are or that they should be targets for violence. They may be predisposed because of their upbringing and the way that they were raised and the culture they grew up in to be the sorts of people who would be at the end of this decision matrix, viable moral targets, but they are not automatically, just by virtue of being a member of that group. So first and foremost, we need to address that. The second is that this person needs to be a rational actor, somebody who is capable of taking in information and making an informed decision about the way that they behave and operate in the world. They need to be of the age of ascension. They need to be a whole legal moral entity who is capable of acting with agency. independent of anyone else. Third, that individual needs to be sufficiently informed and aware of the circumstances that they're in. If they're completely ignorant of the things that are going on around them, then I don't think, bear any moral responsibility for them. So they need to be sufficiently aware of the circumstances of the colonial or slave state or what have you. Now, we can have a very fine-grained argument about what would constitute sufficient awareness or what would constitute a long enough time to have become sufficiently aware if you so chose to pay attention to the obvious. That's a conversation that could take a very long time. And it's not something I'm going to address in the scope of this little short video here. But for the time being, for the sake of this, let's imagine that there's some sort of like platonic ideal of sufficient understanding, and imagine that this person has attained to that. They need to know what's going on, and they need to understand their role in that in order to be responsible for it, and thus morally culpable. And then finally, following all of that, this person needs to understand the situation that they're in, understand the circumstances of their society, their role within it, and they need to choose not to divest themselves from that. They need to choose to continue to exist within and uphold the systems of a society that is founded on that type of oppression. And if you meet all of those burdens that we just laid out, if you are involved in a colonial or slave type power structure, regardless of your ethnicity, you could be a member of the colonized group and be a member of the power structure. If you're involved in that structure, you are someone who is capable of making a rational decision. If you have the sufficient information to understand the place that you are in relation morally to the people who are being oppressed, and you have chosen not to, at a minimum, completely divest yourself from that system, if not outright oppose it, then as far as I'm concerned, morally, from a purely normative standpoint, you are the reason that God invented AK-47s. If you are not that person that I just described, in my view, you are not a legitimate moral target for violence, and anyone who does violence against you, even in the name of anti-colonialism, should be held morally accountable for that. Important to note here, moral accountability does not denote anything else or any other type of accountability. It does not mean that another state has the right to disrupt the anti-colonial activities in order to bring you to justice. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that you should be condemned morally, ideally by your own people, but not ideally just on Twitter somewhere, right? But just because someone has done a morally negative thing within the space of an anti-colonial movement does not give the colonial movement or its allies any legitimacy in continuing to exist. That is an important caveat and something I very much believe. So we should treat people, colonizers and the colonized, enslaved and slavers, we should treat them all equally as moral agents who are human beings, and we should judge them equally morally. That's part of equality. But moral judgments, again, do not automatically convert into prescriptive action. So just because someone may have done something morally questionable does not mean that the movement that they are attached to is itself morally questionable, and it does not mean that anyone has a right to interfere with it in terms of a state or any other actor responding with violence, if that makes sense. Going back to what I said at the beginning, it is important for me to again reiterate that what I am laying out here is a moral position, not a prescriptive argument. Just because something is morally permissible does not mean that it is necessarily the most pragmatic or the wisest thing that you could do. There are times and places in the world where responding to an oppressive system with violence is totally morally permissible, but it would be a bad idea because of the potential negative consequences that would result from that. So ultimately, I am not saying that anyone who is oppressed anywhere should go out and commit violence. I'm saying that most people who are oppressed in most situations, it would be morally permissible for them to use violence against the people who are morally culpable in their oppression. And whether or not that is a good idea in terms of achieving their goals of liberty is an entirely separate discussion that hopefully they will onboard and think very deeply about before they get involved with it. But if some colonizers die in the process, well, fuck them. I don't really care. That is how I feel fundamentally. I really don't care what happens to people in that breakdown criteria, but I think it's important to talk about the nuances of who specifically falls into that sorting algorithm, who comes out the other side of it. And it is important to talk about the difference between a morally permissible decision and a pragmatic decision. And that's really all I wanted to say. Sorry if this was rambling. I think that it's important to qualify statements like this very carefully for all the reasons that I've said, and I just wanted to take the time to do that. And hopefully this didn't go on for too long, and I appreciate you indulging me. And if there's anybody out there who is presently under the boot of a colonial regime, do what you got to do. But think very deeply before you do it. And I just wanted to address all of that up front at the beginning of this conversation before we got into that specifically. And of course, I'm speaking only for myself. This is just my personal opinion. I don't want to put words in the mouth of my guest. Everything that I have said, both in this short little clip here at the front and the things that I say in the interview, are my thoughts alone. And if you don't like them, well, just be mean to me on Twitter about it, I guess. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will let you get to the interview. Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards, once again, from the editing room, just really quickly. At one point, I say that it was John Locke who said that slaves always have a right to rise up and kill their masters, and I know the pedants are going to get after me on that. I misspoke. It is actually Thomas Hobbes who said that in Leviathan. I just misremembered the quotation. If you're watching on YouTube, it should be up on the screen right now. So for everybody that was going to get on my back for messing that up, just back off, man. For everybody else, I'm going to stop belaboring this, and I'm going to finally let you get to the interview and the wonderful Lua. So without any further delay, he said for the fourth or fifth fucking time, I give you Professor Flowers. Lua, Professor Flowers, thank you so much for joining me. Folks may or may not know this, but you were the first person who ever agreed to talk to me, and I've been wanting to get you back on for a little while, and I'm so happy that you're coming back. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So it hasn't been quite a year since we last talked. I think it's been like 8 or 10 months, but it's been a pretty eventful year. Everything's a dumpster fire, and we're trying our best to fix it. And we may talk about just sort of like the general state of online bullshit. And then I'm really interested to hear what you think about the direction that we need to head in terms of like the we being the online left, and like how we need to pursue like a more hopeful vision of the future. But Do you maybe want to kind of recap what you think are the highlights of, what's been going on since we last talked, and I'll ask you some questions off of that.
Yeah, I think maybe like what's been going on is and I didn't realize this so much at the time. I thought of like when I started making videos, I really thought of the online left as like, H bomber guy, ContraPoints, Big Joel, and those things aren't necessarily untrue. But then there was like kind of an issue with how white whatever the online left is considered. And so I made some videos on that. And then I think there's like been this larger problem that's become glaringly clear around just debate bros and their reach to people. Um, like there's like a lot of people of color getting chased off their platforms, things like that, where it's just like, to me, like the issue around all that really actually speaks not just to debate bros, it's actually kind of goes back to the original issue of how white the online left is. I think it's actually
Mm.
is a generally hostile place for a lot of, um, particularly Black and Indigenous content creators. Um, and I think that hostility has become more than just like, the hostility that I first noticed was like people would rather hear white people talk about racism than from a Black person.
Mhm.
And that's like a massive issue. Like there's so much information loss and humanity loss. Like that was already like a pretty big issue. But now there's like this issue of, like I was in a debate and I talked about decolonization, and then that was compared to white genocide. And it's like
Yeah.
that in itself is just like, we have an issue here. And though it wasn't on land back, it sparked a conversation on land back. And then people were like, well, what's land back? Is land back going to be an ethnic cleansing? Is land back going to be a
Mhm.
genocide? And so then we had a really hard time talking about land back, a very, very important movement. And I think actually talking
Mhm.
about land back, even though that's not what the debate was on, I think actually talking about land back and decolonization is something that's really hopeful, something that's really exciting. That's like actually like, you have these activists laying down the groundwork for everything that we as leftists are talking about
Mhm.
anti-capitalism, talking about revolutionary work, talking about, uh, like, and, ending all these systemic oppressions. It's like people who are fighting and laying back are working on this. It's like, it's really incredible. So it's like, that's something to be inspired about. But yeah, that's just kind of like a general, I think the general issues in a nutshell.
Yeah. I think there's a bunch of stuff we could talk about in there, but
Hmm.
one of the things that jumps out kind of immediately to me is when, like you said, when you first kind of came onto the online left scene, it was overly white, in and it felt like it was in the sense that that was a um, marketing problem. Like it was white people tend to like to consume content by other white people. They're not going to go out of their way to consume content by people of color, and it was racist in that sense, but it wasn't like overtly hostile. And now more and more we have seen um, like overt hostility towards content creators and people of color who are speaking about issues that affect them directly from their own lived experience. There's this, and I mean, there's we could dissect that all day. There's like this. On the one hand, I think what's there's a jealousy there where it's like, well, if all of these folks are talking about their issues publicly, then I can't talk about them. I can't, I don't get to be the mouthpiece for the movement anymore. And that takes away from like fundamentally my bottom line, be it money or clout. But also just there's a problem with fucking racism in our community. And it's really starting to be, it was apparent before, but now it is unignorable. And it's something that we really, really need to get our fucking house in order. And I think the debate that you were in is it elucidates, I think, that problem very clearly, which is the Western mode of leftism is in many ways built upon a foundation of white supremacy, right? Like, I think the points that I believe you were trying to make in that conversation are pretty universally true on the face of it, right? Like, people who have been colonized have the right to resist their colonization. They have the right to do so unmolested. And the presumption that that resistance will include genocide is itself it's one of the oldest justifications for continued colonial activity, right? It's a white supremacist talking point as old as time. And that is like that distrust of minorities and people of color is baked into the cake in a lot of Western leftist traditions. And we're starting to see that like facade break a little bit. And it's really illuminating to see which way people break on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly it. Um, yeah. I don't even know if I have anything to add. I just think that hits the nail on the head.
Yeah. So, yeah, maybe we can just. I think it's fair to just say that there's a fucking really shitty racist problem, and if you're not aware of what is going on, like if you're listening to this now and you have no idea what Lou and I are talking about, then part of me wants to say good, you're better for it, but the other part of me wants to say that means that maybe you're not aware of the actual problem, and I think it bears some investigation. I would say that watching your video on Vosh, I think you've done two now, but there's one in particular that was, I think, that outlines the problem very well. The first one, right? Yeah. So your video on Vosh, and then FD Signifier's video on Breaking Bread, and then John the Duncan's video on leftist white supremacy. Like, if you want an encapsulation of the problem as it exists, I think those three videos will give you what you need to know, really. And do you know anybody that would like be a good and that would be good on that list in terms of like stuff for people
Yeah.
homework
Bad
wise?
Mouse also made a video on it as well. He
Okay.
he for those of you who don't know, he's a YouTuber who kind of quit YouTube, and he has a short video on that, but he uh people are, quote unquote, saying like he came out of retirement to come on to comment on this issue, and I think he has some good thoughts on that. So yeah, I think all those things like combined just kind of lay out the issues with
Yeah.
this, because I think a lot of people are so, because of the lack of investment in Black and Indigenous views, it's hard for people to understand like why. Well, it's hard for some people to understand like why what happened was so racist. Like when that
Mm.
debate happened, the white people who came to my defense, which I do appreciate that happened, but the white people came to my defense were like, well, Vosh is misrepresenting you. That was the thing that I heard a lot. Like, this isn't really your views, this is misrepresentation. And that's an issue. But understanding, like, the way that you laid it out, Mark, where it's like, again, like someone's talking about decolonization and you start bringing up this fear of white genocide, this fear of retribution. And that's not something that's like actually on the table. That's not something that colonized or indigenous people are talking about. And so when you bring that up, it just starts to focus the fear of white people. And then it makes it so it's hard. We can't work together because of that fear. Because I
Mhm.
think, I think colonized and indigenous people, want to work together, it's not something that's like exclusive. It's not like, hey, like we can't have any white people working together.
Mhm.
It's actually like it'd be very helpful to to have us all uh being on the same page about this. So then it just makes the struggle harder. But I think people don't understand, because I think what's happening too is like a lot of people were like, well, like I actually am worried about white genocide, without understanding like just how racist that is. Um,
Mhm.
like, and I think those videos do like a pretty good job of laying out like this is why we don't need to be afraid of
Yeah.
colonized people pulling a genocide, and also just going into the racism of the online left. So they provide a lot of clarity.
Yeah. And just to hit one more time on the white genocide thing, that it cannot be overstated how much that talking point has been used to justify some of the worst behaviors that human beings have ever visited on their fellow man. The that was used to justify like slavery in America, like chattel slavery, right? If you go back and you read the arguments against abolitionists, a lot of what the people in the antebellum South are saying is we can't give these people their freedom because if we do, they're going to rise up and kill us, right? Like we have to continue slavery to protect ourselves. It's the same argument that's used to perpetuate colonialism against the Palestinians. It's just everywhere that you have colonialism, you have that argument. It's the argument uh, of perpetuating, like particularly settler colonialism, but any type of racialized uh, dominant structure where one group has power over another. That exists, and it is the foundational lie because at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of people who are subjugated in a system like that, all they want is to be full, equal human beings, and they're not interested in that type of wholesale violence. And to use that as a as a weapon to prevent forward social change is the like foundational white supremacy myth, and it needs to be something that is pointed out and attention needs to be called to that. And anybody who uses that argument, I don't believe in essentializing people based on their arguments, right? Like I think people can, and I think we talked about this the last time we talked, that you can say something racist, you can do something racist, you can say something that is furthering white supremacy or any type of power structure without being a racist, without being a white supremacist. It's so baked into the cake in our country that you just do those things without reflecting on them. And what is asked of everybody isn't that you are instantly this paragon of virtue that has eschewed all elements of the toxic culture you're born into. It's that you just reflect on the fucking things that you're doing. And when somebody says to you, hey, you're doing a racism, maybe don't double down for 3 hours about that. Maybe actually go, okay, let me think about that for a second. That's what's asked of you.
Right. It's yeah, I think like the biggest thing I want to ask is just for people to be able to reflect on things. Like in the videos that I had about um the video that I had like laying out uh like the issues that I had with Vosh that eventually led to the debate. It wasn't me so like I made these points about the importance of listening. And listening doesn't mean like I'm just going to do this. When I say listening, I'm talking about like understanding. And I think there's like a lack of the understanding of marginalized people, and especially of Black and Indigenous people. There's like this lack of understanding of like our experiences, of like why we're so upset about racism. And so when you hear information that doesn't sound quite right, instead of you're reacting to it first, just try to understand it and then have your reaction, which I would recommend really in any conflict, like trying to do that. I think that's a good thing to do, but that's really what I'm asking, because I think it's, and what, other people are asking, because you can kind of see what that has led to. Like when there was the Black nationalist debate, and then everyone was afraid of Black nationalism, and they had no idea what it was, though. So they were afraid of something that they didn't understand. And then they
Yeah.
got that mixed up with Black separatism, and
Mm.
there was just like a lack of information. And it wasn't me saying that like, hey, you have to agree with these things. I was really just trying to say these are what these things are. And people are afraid of something that they don't quite understand. So try to understand these things before having a reaction.
Yeah. And I think that and this was something that like has come up around this conversation is the idea that listening to and being receptive to the the information gleaned from the lived experiences of others automatically implies that you have to agree with their solution to a problem. And that's not true, right? Like all that is asked of an individual, right? I'm not a fan of deference epistemology, right? Like I think that what people are obligated to do is to continually listen to other people and to do their absolute best to understand their perspective and where they're coming from. But you're not obligated to agree necessarily with their solution set that they're offering, right? We can have differences that are incommensurable with one another, but I'm still obligated to listen and try to understand why you believe the things that you believe, right? Like um, I am not a fan necessarily of Black separatism, right? But I understand, I think, why people would want that, right, as a defensive measure, right? If you've had your community just annihilated generation after generation, I deeply sympathize with the idea of wanting to just build a place that's just for you, where you can remain unmolested. I don't necessarily think that it's the best long term solution for any of our problems. And I would disagree with the Black separatists about that. And I don't feel I'm obligated to agree with them, but I am obligated to try and understand them and to not paint them in a bad or monstrous light because of that disagreement.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. I saw a lot of people who were separatist, or people who weren't even separatist, like just Black people wanting to have their own safe space or something like
Mhm.
that. Like not even separatist, just getting attacked because they're like, I don't want to talk with white people about racism. I'm just trying to talk to
Mhm.
Black people about this right now. Just even saying that, I saw people getting attacked. And then I did know personally some people
Mhm.
who were separatist that they weren't practicing separatism in a way that was hurtful to anyone, which
Mhm.
I certainly think is possible. And I could get into like a number
Mhm.
of examples where I'm like, wow, that's awful. But I knew people who were just like, I just want to live around Black people and to have Black friends because of my experiences of being around white people and the racism I experienced. And I was like, that's not something that I personally want to do, but I understand the experiences of racism and I understand why you want to do that. And I think if you feel like you need to do that, that makes sense. Um, and I wanted to ask people to have that understanding instead of jumping to the conclusion that this person is a Nazi. That was like just really just seemed
Yeah.
like a massive issue to me. So I wanted to point that out. And yeah, I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I don't remember where I was going exactly with that, but
No, that's I mean that's perfectly valid, right? Like I think the genesis of the idea is important, right? Like people uh, didn't build Tulsa or Rosewood because they were, Black supremacists who wanted to annihilate white people. They built those communities, one, because in large parts they were forced into them by discriminatory practices to begin with, and they were fleeing from danger, as is evident by what eventually happened to those communities. So even if you don't, like, I'm not going to walk into like Black Wall Street and say, well, this is wrong. This is basically just Nazi Germany. This is discriminatory, right? Like, I'm going to walk into that place and I'm going to say, I understand why you did this. And if I were you, I might want to do it too. But I do have some disagreements about the long term ramifications of this policy if it continues. But I also recognize that white folks need to get their shit together in a big way before we start talking about necessarily dismantling this type of structure, right? It's it's just having fucking empathy for people and understanding that very often people who are are advocating for policies like that or practices like that are doing so out of a sense of desperation or defense of their community, and they have valid reasons for feeling that way. And just because you disagree with their conclusions doesn't mean that you can invalidate their very real reasons for having those feelings by comparing them to the fucking Nazis.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that I really want to point out is like when you said that, like you can have disagreements before we talk about those. We have to recognize that white people have to get it together. I think the reason why it's so hurtful to see people just kind of attack Black people in this way is that it puts the burden of ending racism on Black people, and that burden really needs to be. I don't want to call it the white man's burden because there's this like kind of like this guilt. I don't want to go into that, but it's like ending racism needs to be the
Yeah.
responsibility of white people because it was created
Mhm.
by white people. I know it wasn't created by those white people literally. It's the ancestors, but it's like this inherited problem, and so Black people are we're the ones stuck kind of just in this position where we're constantly begging people to care. And so it's like
Mhm.
this kind of like mental like just like even trying to figure out how to talk about racism without feeling like I'm begging people to care is something that's
Mhm.
really tricky to do. And where I can have like my own human dignity, because it is something that's like just degrading, where it's like, please stop being so messed up to me. And then people are just
Mhm.
like they don't want to listen, so there's a point where it starts to feel like begging. It feels like really degrading. And so how to even go about that is like just a traumatic event in itself. And I understand if there's Black people who don't want to fight that fight, and they're just like, I just want to try to be happy and find my own peace. Um,
Mhm.
and so I respect that. And I also, yeah, I also think white people need to recognize that ending racism is something that they need to, it's only going to end if they care about it ending, because the issue of racism isn't actually an issue of Black people.
It's an issue of an imposition of a power structure, and um, I think you know it is possible to upend a power structure from the bottom up. But when that is done, it necessarily, this really is also like the issue with like anti-colonialism, is it is possible for the people who are colonized to overthrow a colonial system on their own, but that is the sort of thing that leads to a lot of people being hurt. And the reason that a lot of people get hurt is because the people who are the colonizers, the people who are embedded within that power structure in a position of power, refuse to change, and hold on to that power structure. And that is fundamentally what leads to violence. It's not people resisting their oppression. It is people holding on to the ability to oppress that leads to violence.
Well, the violence is
And if
already
you are not,
here.
yeah, 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 but like the violence against like the
Sure,
oppressors, I
yeah.
guess. If you are not willing to divest from your position of power in that power structure, then you kind of deserve whatever happens to you, right? Like if I'm in a position of what was it? It was a fucking John Locke who, in a parenthetical statement in the founding documents of what is now modern liberalism, is just like, oh yeah, by the way, slaves always have the right to rise up and kill their masters. End parenthetical statement. Let's move on with it. It's just such an obvious position, and if you are not willing to internalize that and recognize that a power structure that you're involved in is unjust and to seek its dismantling, then sure, yeah, like I'm okay with whatever happens to you because you're signing on with the bad guys, basically, right? I don't have any sympathy for people that voluntarily like support the matrix, you know? Not
Yeah.
that you said any of that. That's me saying all that. I'll own all that. I don't want to put words in your mouth. God knows you've had that happen enough.
Well, I don't think there's anything I can really do to um yeah, I don't know if there's anything I can do to like prevent words being put in my mouth, but yeah, I mean, I kind of like this issue of like signing off on anything. I think that I do just want to like maybe just like qualify that a little bit and say that like
Hmm.
when people are responding to oppression, like I mean, I guess like imagine for anyone who's been bullied, like imagine when you're bullied and you're actually just like, I just need this to stop right now. And so like there's been times where like I've been bullied and I lash out, and that lashing out is to be like stop doing this. And so it's like it's not really like a yeah, I wouldn't say that that people generally have this response to like doing anything. It's really just like trying to do some sort of action where it's like, you're pushed into a corner where reason isn't going to get you out. You're in an unreasonable position fundamentally. So trying to
Hmm.
reason with the people oppressing you isn't working. Trying to like speak to your humanity hasn't worked. And so yeah, and then like that's where the violence comes in, or like the violence that's retaliating against violence. And that is when that happens, it's not like I'm going to just like to do whatever you've been doing to me. It's like stop. It's usually like it's like biting back,
Hmm.
but to say stop. And I think I also want to qualify what I just said too, because I think very often I think at an individual level, while people might act that way, I also think that like there's like this like assumed lack of intelligence of colonized
Hmm.
people. There's like
Hmm.
this kind of stereotype of people being savages, like the way that like black people are painted is like kind of painted as being dumb and just really brutish. And then you go to indigenous people where it's like indigenous people are painted as like just these savages who killed people, and that's not the case for either groups of people. There is, when you read about colonialism and you read about the retaliation against colonialism, like that violence that is enacted is, it's something that's intentional and thought out and intelligent, and with the goal to end colonialism. So it's like it's not like these like dumb savages rising up. And so I also want to like just qualify that and dispel that myth.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, human beings are human beings and are generally intelligent. We're generally an intelligent species, and that crosses all racial lines, right? There's no like just evidentially there is no difference in as far as we're able to tell. Just let's get out in front of the whole bioessentialist argument, right? There is no, as far as we're able to tell, trends in IQ across racial lines that are directly the result of any like cleaving to those racial categories. Human beings are just smart across the board, and people who are oppressed will resist their oppression in a calculated. Many times it is reflexive, right? Like you said, like you just get the bully off of me, but it's often usually like an actual organized counter colonial movement is generally always a calculated effort on the part of intelligent thinking feeling people who are like anybody else in the world who have been put upon their whole lives and are now rising to the challenge of throwing off the shackles of their oppression just as you or I or anyone else would, and to cast them as savages flailing against some violent stimuli that they have no choice to react to, like animals, is also a trope of colonialism, and it reinforces the idea that because an animal or like a savage like would like do the it would not distinguish between um, the people that it needs to hurt and the people that it doesn't, and it would be motivated by this viciousness that it just must continue to harm and continue to harm. And that's not the case. They're just human beings who want the bad thing to stop, and they're going to do what they have to do to make that stop and to live freely, and then they'll probably stop there because that's what you or I would do, because that's what most people would do, and that's all colonized people are, is people who are rising to a challenge, and they're not going to go out of their way to do anything that is overtly or unnecessarily violent, because why would anybody do
Right. Yeah, I think you summarized that much better than I did.
that? No, I think we need to. I don't know. I'm just fucking sick of people making shitty arguments about this. Like, I've been listening to it's the same shit, right? It's the same recycled. I could open a uh, a book about like I could open like a journal from like a British colonial soldier in India talking about putting down the savages in the jungle, and it's the same arguments he's making in that diary are the same shit I'm hearing on pick a given Twitch streamer, right? It's the same stuff. It just keeps coming back over and over again. There's no change to it, and I don't know why that's found a home on the left, but it needs to fucking stop.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good spot to pivot this into a hopeful conversation, because that is, now that we've isolated and defined the problem, we can talk about what the bright shiny future is, because it will be a bright shiny future, because we're going to make it that one. We're going to make it a bright shiny, fucking up words. We're going to make things good better now.
Yeah. I
Good
mean, I
better
still think it
now.
is a good.
What are
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just being dumb. I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can make the left a better place and what we can do for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think making the online left a better place, or at least what we consider the online left, because as I was saying much earlier, there are actually, so like what we consider to be the online left is very white, but I don't think I
Hmm.
mentioned this. There actually are a lot of uh like leftists. I've like run into actually a lot of black leftists who are, they may not call themselves leftists, but they they definitely are. Like they might be like particularly like, there's just like an array of people who, from anarchists to communists to people
Hmm.
who aren't, either of those, but are still very left leaning. And it's kind of amazing. So many of them don't even know who Vosh is or who debate bros are. It's like they're in their own like world. I could just, maybe I don't see everything behind the scenes, but like people are just kind of just trying to like uplift other black people and just talking about leftist stuff without getting attacked, at least as far as I can tell. I'm sure there's always dissenting views, of
Hmm.
course, but I'm like, wow, like I really hope that what is considered the online left can get to this place where we can just kind of talk about these important issues. And the only people who are going to attack us are going to generally just be like conservatives or even liberals. um but yeah, I think my hope, because I think the only way that we can really solve this issue is by having leftist spaces, the what we consider to be the online left, be more welcoming to people of color, particularly black and indigenous people. um because I think so many of the really crucial problems are that of white men, and this kind of like perpetuation of like this dominance of this like kind of like
Hmm.
patriarchal idea of like masculinity that's just kind of like rebranded itself to leftism. um
Hmm.
I think that's like kind of like the biggest issue, but then even without that issue, there's still this kind of like, there's like left tube in being very white. It's like people will talk about Ben Shapiro, but there's like, it's like, where do we go from here? We've talked about Ben Shapiro so many times. We've talked about Steven Crowder so many times. Like, what's
Hmm.
next? And so, honestly, like, even with like the issue of debate bros aside, like, I think the future. I think if there is going to be a future, I think needs to be this like place that includes Black and Indigenous people, where we're connecting, where we're trying to learn together and have actual solidarity, not just,
Hmm.
hey, Ben Shapiro's racist and I think that's bad, but learning how to just learning how to be able to actually be there for one another. um, and being inviting Black and Indigenous people. And then I think that comes down to really focusing on colonialism. Like there's a way where colonialism's like kind of just like this thing on the side. Like, yeah, like colonialism's awful, but colonialism is actually like the issue of our time. And I don't think that a lot of white people understand that in a way that a lot
Mm.
of Black and Indigenous people really do. That we're actually dealing, especially like when we're talking about like the US and Canada, even just the world. Like, let me just say this: like, most of the world has either been colonized and overthrew their colonialist powers, or is still colonized, and like that's most of the world today. Like understanding the issues of colonialism and how they're intertwined with capitalism,
Hmm.
is really, really important in a way that I think a lot of people in the online left don't understand. And so, like when we're talking about colonialism, it's something that we can't really talk about dismantling capitalism without talking about colonialism. When we're talking about the issues of transphobia, for example, where it's like so many groups of people that are indigenous to the U.S. and Canada didn't have an issue with people being queer, people being trans, people being gay, and also the same for so much of Africa. That was something that like literally happens because of colonizers, forcing Christianity on them, and also same to Black slaves. So it's like there's like this issue of like gender oppression, this issue of transphobia, this issue of capitalism, and the issue of climate change. All really comes down to colonialism, and defeating colonialism means defeating all these things, and so it's like actually the movement of like land back and any decolonization movements are actually really, really exciting. They're really inspiring because
Mm.
I think a lot of people on the online left are like, well, what do we do? We know that these things are an issue, but what do we do? What we can do is we can look, I think there's like two main things that we can really do. We can look at the Black revolutionary work that Black people have done, looking at the civil rights movement, looking at the Black Power movement, looking at the Black Panthers, looking at what they did because they were the most revolutionary. Like if there was a revolutionary movement that was going to get something done, at least in the U.S., it was them. They got
Mm.
pretty much their leaders got assassinated and like the movement died. But we need to look at what they
Yeah.
did, where to kind of pick up from there. It doesn't mean they had to agree with everything, but they kind of were like they were doing so much. They had dual power structures, had mutual aid, and had their own essentially like militia, which I guess sounds really
Mm.
scary, but that was for them that was very much in defense of the police terrorizing their communities.
Mm.
But they were doing this revolutionary work in a way that like no one was doing in the US. And then we can look at what Indigenous people are doing right now. So like Indigenous people are like leading the forefront of anti-climate change and ending climate change, stopping it, preventing it, and also just looking at what people are doing in their fight for land back and understanding what's going on there with land back and land reclamation, um, and supporting our Indigenous comrades there. So I think the online left has to really focus on these things, has to really understand, because I think honestly, like the movement that's happening is focused around like Black and Indigenous people, and it's completely ignored on the online left. I've had leftists tell me like, how do we get Black people more interested in leftism, and I'm just like, just feels like a slap in the face, honestly. It's like
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
the amount of work that Black people are doing, and actually it's just that like white people don't care to look at what Black people are doing, and they're doing a
Yeah.
lot of work. What are Black people don't care to look at what Indigenous people are doing. But I don't want to say that I am frustrated about that, but I do want to focus on how like inspiring that is, because there is a movement happening. There's things happening that we can support. And so that is actually really exciting because people are already laying the foundations of like what we can do. So I think the future of the online left needs to include Black and Indigenous people. I don't think that means that people have to stop making videos on PragerU or Ben Shapiro. But I think people are like, well, what do we do beyond that? And it's like, well, there's actually so much going on. And that's really exciting to me. And that stuff that's going on, like, is so liberating, not just for Black and Indigenous people, but for all of us. And so, like, that solidarity, that feeling of us coming together and being able to work on all these issues together is really exciting for me personally. And I think that's something that, can spread, that we can share with everyone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think so in particular with like the online left and like people who are on the YouTubes and doing podcasts and stuff. Like I think that there's two layers at which you can approach what leftism is, right? There's the theory layer and there's the praxis layer. There's talking and then there's doing. And I think both have value. I think there is a place for, not necessarily maybe like, super like uh, cringy, debatey react stuff. I think maybe the time for that has passed, but there is a place for this is what we think, this is why we think it, this is why the people that we're arguing against are wrong, and there's that space where conversation and discourse can happen and be productive, and that has a value. And then there is the space, but that value is contingent entirely upon whether or not it informs the praxis, right? Talking is good, but talking should be inspiring towards or informing action, because is it like what the Catholics say, like faith without good works is dead, like leftism without material change is dead. There's no point to it if you're not actually doing the thing at the end of, not necessarily one individual person, but if somebody in your movement isn't doing the thing to make the change, there's no point. So and I think both are important, but what I think one of the problems that we have with the online left is that a lot of people who are doing the talky bits think that what they're doing is as important as the dewy bits, and that they have placed primacy on, this is where I think like debate bros come in, is I think a lot of them think that what they're doing is as good as action, and it is fucking not at all. At the end of the day, like this conversation that we're having right now, I think is important, and I think it's productive, and I think hopefully there are people out there who listen to this and that wrinkles their brain a bit and they change their ideas and they get involved. But at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't go out and do something, then there's no point to what we're doing right now, right? So, like that's kind of how I look at it. Is it's important to understand what layer you're operating in, and if you're up here, that like in the talky part, then you should always at some point say, okay, well, this is how you can go do something. This is how you can get involved. You should be talking towards action. Which, pursuant to that, if anybody who's listening to this is actually on the ground, like actively doing shit, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk to you and put you out there for whatever reach I have. Just throwing that out there. But yeah, I think that that's kind of where I'm at with it. Is I like the talking, I like the theory, but I also think that we need to understand that the theory has no point if it doesn't lead to action.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think it's really important to understand. I think it's really important to understand like the limits of talking on YouTube, and the importance of action. I think there's a way where people are just kind of like, yeah, like I know I'm not doing stuff in person, but I want to be, but I'm not sure what to do. And I think a lot of walls that I run into with it are just like so much of what you can do is local. So it's like it can sometimes be hard to like talk about like what you can do, because like that's a conversation for specifically where you live at times, like getting
Mhm.
involved in organizations. But there is a way where I do think that there's a way where we can really talk about like how to practice mutual aid. This person
Mhm.
that I followed, so her name is Dr. Pam Palmater. Her channel is called Pam Palmater, and she just like brought on this person who just talked about how she just like during the pandemic, like this person like just like established this mutual aid network around potatoes. Um, just like went to this farm, like was like, oh, I want to pick up some potatoes, and like posted on Facebook, does anyone else need any potatoes? Because the grocery stores were empty. This was like
Hmm.
during maybe the beginning of the pandemic or something like that. So the grocery stores were empty, and then like she thought she was gonna get some potatoes for herself. She came back with like thousands and thousands of pounds of potatoes, like carried them in her truck. And like, I'm not saying that's what everyone needs to do. It's just
Hmm.
like there's like this way where she's like very attentive, like, oh, how can I help my community, like where I am? And again, that's a very local thing. I think that's what it keeps on coming back to. But I think even like hearing her story, like we need to be thinking like, what can we do in our communities right now? How can we like help support each other, especially like there's like this practicality of it, like things are really messed up with the pandemic, and things were already messed up enough, and so like trying to be attentive to how we can help each other. um yeah, I don't really have like a clear answer of like what we can each do, because again, I think at this point I feel like it is so local, but I think
Yeah.
there's a way where we can use YouTube and streaming to inspire people around that.
Yeah. And I think that like specifically thinking now about like our disabled comrades, like just because you're not physically out in the world lifting something heavy doesn't mean that you're not contributing, right? Praxis does not have to mean manual labor. um, you can do things, right? Like all those protesters need signs, right? Like the digital propaganda is a booming industry right now. There's a lot of ways you can get involved with that, and honestly, just doing videos, like I as I said, I think the theory is important, but so if you're making content like this, I think you are contributing, but it's important to just drive, like there's this uh flyer that I saw once, and I'll probably put like a picture of it up on stream or on the video if I can find it again, but it's a picture of an AK-47, and or somebody holding one, and then it has like lines like leading away from it, and it's like this person carried the ammunition, this person grew the food that the person holding the rifle ate, this person like paid the light bill of whoever, and it's just like you go down this chain of like for every shooter out there in the world, which obviously nonviolence, yada yada yada, whatever. But for every shooter out there in the world, in the revolution, there's 20 or 30 people behind that person that made that possible. And you don't necessarily have to be like Rambo in the trenches to be making a practical material difference. There's a way for you, like Lewis said, in your community. Find out what your community needs and find out how you personally can help that along. You don't have to shoulder the whole burden on yourself, right? That's why we're communists. Is it's about all of us together making it happen. So don't feel like you have to shoulder the whole burden, right? You just got to do the whatever it is that you can do. That's what you do, right? From each according to their abilities.
Yeah, completely. Oh, I do want to just say something else on that. Like, I think there's
Mhm.
a way, um, I don't know. I think there's a way where like the internet, even though it's not everything, is a really powerful tool to disseminate information. And
Mhm.
I just don't want that to go to waste. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I have to actually think about that a little bit more. There's a way where I've seen like the way that right wingers use the internet is actually like the way they can like mobilize a movement.
Mhm.
um just and like so much of that is happening through the internet. Not saying that we should be like right wingers, like they do like a lot of, you know there's like a lot of misinformation happening and things like that, but there is I just hope that the left can like use uh the internet as powerful of a tool, but instead of it for pushing right wing propaganda, for
Mhm.
pushing solidarity and a viable leftist movement in the U.S. But I have to think more about like maybe some things that they do that maybe we could do, because they seem to be really successful with it. Like they're not tearing each other apart in the way that I think
Mhm.
that we're tearing each other apart. But the way that we're tearing each other apart, I think, is like there's like legitimately things that we need to talk about. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like we have legitimate shit to sort out, but I actually think a lot about that specific thing that you mentioned, like the propaganda network of the online right. Did are you familiar with, or did you ever read Becca Lewis's alternative influence network study?
Mm-mm.
Um, it's a study where it was right around like 2016 or so. This social scientist Rebecca Lewis, she looked at the view counts and like the subscriberships of all of these different YouTube accounts and streamers on the right, and looked at the overlap between them and like the cross pollination. And she made this like heat map of, the like where every personality was like a node in this network, and like how they all shuffled viewers between them. So you had like Joe Rogan over here, and then you had like, you go from Joe Rogan to like Gavin McInnes to like, some like straight up Nazi, and like it mapped the alt right pipeline basically. And
Mm.
I looked at that, and first I was horrified, and then I was inspired, and I said, "We need one of those. we
Yeah.
need that." And I think we're starting to build it. Like I think people think of propaganda sometimes, particularly on the left, as like a dirty word. I think we need to, with a certain level of intentionality, go about spreading our ideas in a interconnected communal way, like the right does, because the right has billionaires funding them with like fossil fuel money and like Boeing and, like all the profits from Raytheon and shit. We don't have that. We have to be more like, if you're a right winger, like, you can just be a failed stand-up comedian and make $2 million by, shitting on social justice warriors, because somebody will pay you to do that. They stumbled into their influence system. We need to be more intentional about it. We need to actively pursue these connections that we're building and bigging up these propaganda networks. And that's a fair bit of like, when I think about like what I want my channel to be, is like, I'm trying to, the best that I'm able, be a productive node in a propaganda network for the left. So that's actually something I've spent a fair bit of my time thinking about, and I agree completely. Like, we need to figure out a way to match, not necessarily completely copy one to one, but like match and combat what the right is doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what's I think we might be wrapping up here in a little bit, but I want you to tell everybody like what's in the future for you. Like, what can we, where are we, where are we going to next see Lua?
Yeah. I'm trying to work on a video just talking about why I haven't been able to post in a while. We'll see, because it's really personal. Um and we'll see if it makes sense for me to post it. That's what I've been working on for a bit. I'm just trying to kind of like, I think what happened with the debate bros was like really wild, but then there's like all this stuff that happened behind the scenes that also was just as messed up, or if not even more. So I've just been trying to like kind of get back into the swing of things. But yeah, that's kind of my hope, is to post that video in the next bit of time.
Okay. Yeah, well, maybe it'll. We're recording this a fair bit in advance, so maybe they'll drop around the same time, and we can cross pollinate audiences. We'll point one to the other. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. All right. Well, Lua, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. Do you want to plug all your pluggables and tell everybody where and how to find you?
sure. You can find me on YouTube at Professor Flowers, and on Twitter you can find me at Lua Borealis.
Okay. All right. Well, Lua, Professor Flowers, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Hey, everybody. Mark Edwards again. And I want to thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do here and you want to support me financially, then please consider becoming a patron. You'll keep the lights on over here, and you'll get early access to any of the audio that I release. If you want to make a one-time donation, you can do so on Venmo, Coffee, or PayPal. All of those donation links are all at Ultraviolet Pod. And please consider donating to my guest as well. Lua's Patreon and other links are in the down there part in the show notes on YouTube or on the website. So please go out and support Lua. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and subscribe to me on Spotify, iTunes, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts. Leave a comment. That really helps me with the algorithm. And upvote it. Give it 5 stars. Do all the uppy, make number go wee things that you can do on the internet, and it'll really help me, and I will love you forever for it. If you would like to follow me on social media, you can find me on Twitter at UltravioletPod. I am also on Facebook and Instagram on the same @ though less frequently. And occasionally I pop up on Twitch playing whatever video game I happen to have downloaded at UVPod. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.